along this afternoon. I have no idea how accurate that is as a title, but I figured it was broad enough to try and capture as many people as possible. So today what I'm going to do is talk about a change that I have made to delivery, which I made in the previous academic year, based on a desire to address each of these. So getting students to engage both with the material that's on Blackboard and also with what we were doing in class, by encouraging them to prepare stuff in advance, which hopefully then would help them with their own time management, their participation in the classroom itself, and ultimately in the performance of their work. Unfortunately, with regards to that last point, I won't be mentioning it directly today because I'm in the process of marking the first assignment of the students, the final year students that I've been testing this on at the moment. So wanted to wait until I was able to make a year-on-year comparison, because what I'm going to be talking about is a comparison between what I did last year and what I've done this year, which was to some extent motivated by the current situation that we find ourselves in. So the first thing was that my original thinking came out of these particular aspects that were problematic, and hopefully some or all of these will be challenges that you will also recognize. So here I'm thinking most specifically about seminars rather than lectures. One of the challenges was actually getting people to turn up for some reason, and I know there are various different reasons for this, but attendance tends to be quite poor, and particularly as we progress through the year, and even amongst final year students who you would think would be amongst the most motivated students, because they're very conscious of the fact that they're coming to the end of their time at the university, and the significance of the assessments that they're going to be doing puts an extra emphasis on them. But they just weren't turning up. The second thing was that even the students who were turning up had quite often not actually done any preparation for the seminar. And to give you one example from today, first thing this morning, I had a final year seminar, and there were a third of the students who should have been there in the room, and of the third who had turned up, which was about 9 students, none of them had read the material in advance of undertaking the seminar. In this particular instance, these were 2 short online articles. You know, this wasn't a huge thing for people to do. It wasn't some detailed research paper. It was a relatively straightforward article for people to read. One of the other challenges is the fact that we provide weekly amounts of work based around the topics that we need to cover in order for the students to gather the material to prepare themselves for the assessment. And clearly we plan this over a number of weeks, and yet the vast majority of the students seem not to be aware of the fact that it would be beneficial to them to pace themselves in terms of the work that they do. So there seems to be this sense in which everything can be left until the last minute, and that includes even looking at lecture material, or certainly looking at the material that's required for the seminars. And that's kind of allied to this last thing, which is this next thing, which is specifically related to the assessments themselves. However much we may try and stretch out the delivery of the material, however much we may try and incorporate pointing the students towards where the material fits within their assessment, a lot of students leave even looking at the assignments until the last minute. And that causes all kinds of problems then in terms of them understanding where the material is, in terms of them being able to ask the right questions, and in terms of them being able to put together what would represent their best piece of work. Now, I have some sympathy for this. As a student, I was one of those people who would tend to put off doing the assignments till the last minute. but I attended all of my lectures. I did all of the reading. I attended all of my seminars. I participated in all of the seminars. I was just lazy. So didn't disadvantage me quite as much as it might be with our students, because there was that continuous process involved. And the next thing, which has also been kind of exacerbated this year, because of the changes that have been made with lectures being asynchronous and seminars being delivered live, but obviously remotely, in terms of what appears on the student timetable, if it's on the student timetable, then they recognize it as being significant. They don't necessarily still do it, but at least they understand that, you know, it's there because it's something that they're supposed to be doing. If it doesn't appear on the timetable, then they seem unable to grasp that they should be able to control their own time. And anecdotally, we have had students saying, oh, I wish the lectures were still on the timetable because I'm struggling to keep up because I don't know when I'm supposed to be doing them. And again, that seemed a very odd thing for students to think. So last year, I decided I was going to use a workbook. And the reason why I decided to use a workbook is based on this analogy. Apologies if anyone has been in one of these presentations before with me, where I may have used the same analogy, and I'm hoping that it still works. So amongst the many strings to my bow, I'm a keen model maker, and I operate in all kinds of different materials, from balsa wood and clay, but I do have a fondness for making airfix kits of model aeroplanes, Second World War, British and German, in case anyone was interested, which I'm sure you're probably not. And the reason why I'm going to use this is because I think it illustrates the kind of bits that we control in quite a nice way. So when you actually get the box, when you open it up, inside there are these things called sprues, and all the bits and pieces that go together to create the model are included on those sprues. So if you think about that as the content, that's actually the material, the subject matters, the topics, the issues that you want the students to actually have. So you're going to give them to them. And then what you're going to do is explain to them what they need to do with that material. So the instructions that come in an airfix kit actually tell you how to take the little plastic parts and put them together. And in some respects, that's what we're doing when we give instructions as to how the material is relevant to the assignment, or indeed the process parts of you know, how to put the assignment together. And so it's the instructional part, so that we're not just giving information. And to be fair, the education system that I went through was pretty much just around information giving. And even in seminars, most of the seminars were discussions and negotiations between the students themselves, where the lecturers may, you know, offer some advice. So for example, if anyone is interested in making any of these plastic models, one piece of advice would be don't use polystyrene cement, which is the cement you would normally use to put the plastic bits together, when it comes to working with the clear plastic elements. So in this case, the canopies for the pilot's cockpit, because the polystyrene cement is very, very good on the sort of solid plastics, but the clear plastic is quite different, and it actually makes it go opaque. So it ruins the sort of look of that. If you're going to put these together, you find a reasonable alternative. And there is a make of super glue that I use, because it's not specifically a super glue, but it functions in that way. So the second bit is the instructions. That's us telling the students, or helping the students to see how they put the material together, what they're actually aiming towards. And with that regard, every box will come either with a picture on the outside or the inside that shows you what the finished product should look like. And this is also to help you then with the painting and the decals that go on. And from an assessment point of view, we could think of those as the nice polished bits. So, you know, here's the basic content, here are the instructions how to put it together, but then we're also going to show you some previous students' work so you can see what a good quality output would look like. We're also going to talk to you about the paint and the decals, the little I'm not sure what you'd call them actually. Decals is the only word I really know. The little transfers that go on that turn it from looking like a paint, looking like just a plastic model into actually looking like a real model aircraft, because it resembles the larger version of what it is. So from an assessment point of view, it's making sure that students have got citations, that they've expressed themselves in an articulate way, in a way that makes sense, that their arguments are coherent. Because you don't just want them to write a report, you want them to be able to write a good report, and hopefully you end up with something that looks like that. And in case anyone's interested, yes, that is one of mine. Now, for those who are in the know, the reason why the colors may look a little odd is because I only use gloss paints as opposed to matte paints, because they're more resilient and they last longer, and the matte paints tend to flake a bit. But anyway, roughly speaking, that's what it's supposed to look like. So it looks reasonably like the thing that you can see on the left-hand side in the picture. So we give them the content, we talk to them how to put the stuff together, we talk to them about how to polish their assignments, and then hopefully they produce a piece of work that looks like that. Unfortunately, a lot of my students produce a piece of work that looks more like that. And that causes me pain, because I think, well, I've given you all the content that you need, and I've pointed you in the direction of content, and I thought my instructions were clear in terms of how you should put it together and what you should do and where you should go and look. And I've tried to help you as much as possible with the assessment in terms of showing you previous students' work, and maybe in giving you some examples of feedback that students have got, certainly giving you an assessment criteria that gives a very detailed breakdown. I've given you instructions on how to actually lay out the report. So it's a little bit disappointing when you end up with something like that. And even more, it's disappointing when you end up with something like that. So there are some students who, for various different reasons, seem to completely misunderstand the whole purpose and process of what you've gone through. And I was thinking, well, how can we actually address this? And in particular, I wanted to address the second part. So the set of instructions that we have, and the getting people to do something with the content, not just in terms of the assessment, but with regards to the process that they go through over a whole semester or 2 semesters, however long they've got. So I came up with an idea of producing a workbook. This was specifically for a group of students on a final year module that I teach, where the first assessment is, it's a report, but it's not in a standard report format. There are basically 7 questions that they need to answer, all about an advertising campaign. And those 7 questions are addressed within the first 9 weeks. We lose an introductory week and we lose an enhancement week. So in the first 9 weeks, all of those 7 questions are covered. And in order to help them, both in terms of preparing for the seminars, but also preparing for the assessment, the kind of questions that they're going to have to answer in order to actually address those 7 questions were then included within a workbook. So there was a weekly activity that they had to undertake. It wasn't a particularly onerous one. In some cases, they just had to go off and find 3 examples of something and write down their URLs, or write down a 3-sentence description of something. But it helped them in terms of what they needed to do in advance of the seminar, and because they were also related to what they would need to do for the assessment. Each week, they were going to be expected to bring their workbook into the classroom. Each week I would sign the workbook off, assuming that they had done the work. And the payback on that was that at the end of the 9th week, they could then submit the whole workbook to me. And for every section where they had had it signed off, so in other words, they had done some work in advance of coming to the seminar, they would then get some feedback. And that was kind of their preparatory feedback ready for when they actually did the assessment. The assessment wasn't due in until after Christmas, so they still had a number of weeks to actually look at the feedback and ask further questions or do further research. But it was a way of encouraging them to participate in something, which was essentially providing them with formative feedback by encouraging them to collect together a portfolio of work over a period of time. Now, this year, for very obvious reasons, although I had already determined that I was going to make some changes, we can't ask them to bring the work with them. And although I had used electronic sign-off for students who, for various reasons, couldn't get in the previous year, we're all under a lot of pressure. We're all doing quite a lot of work, and I didn't want to have the onerous activity of having to kind of provide an electronic sign-off, and in a way that was going to be secure enough for me to sort of benefit from that. But what I did was I put together a study guide, and I took it a step further because I wanted to make it something that the students could refer to on a regular basis. So provide them with a lot of information that would help them on a step-by-step basis to actually complete the work that they were required to do each week, but also to add some extra information as well. So I'm going to take you through that now, but I'm going to talk about this more from the point of view of the study guide. So the idea was to provide them with a permanent single reference point, a single document that contained, this is how to work your way through this module. I wanted to make it a little bit more useful than the handbook, because the handbook contains a lot of information that is there for very good reasons, but actually is the same across all modules. And a lot of it is information that students don't need until particular points in the module as well. I wanted to introduce the students to me and the module in less formal language. So there's a picture of me at the beginning. There's a little bit of blurb about who I am, about how the module will operate. I've tried to think about it from the point of view of what the students want to know and in the order in which they want to know it. I've also tried to change the language. So instead of talking about students, I talk about you. And so it becomes hopefully a bit more of a dialogue. The week-by-week guide literally takes them step by step through what they need to do. And one of the ways in which I also tried to make this more appropriate for the target audience was to use icons. So each week, and these are just the set that I'm using for this one module, we are using other icons in other modules. And I know that there are other colleagues who are using study guides who have actually created other icons to go with those. But clearly the first part was go and look at the PowerPoint slides, listen to the audio. I normally record a separate MP3 and then do a Panopto recording on the basis of both of those as an extra. The reason for doing the MP3 separately is so that if the students want to, they can actually just listen to the MP3 and they don't have to have the slides in front of them. Then there is an activity for them to do. So there was actually a physical box. It asked them a question, it asked them to complete that in. The fourth one there, the little palette, was a creative consideration. It's a creative activity, and I wanted them to start thinking about creativity very early on. And then the last one is actually the collaborate symbol, because that was asking them to go to the seminar, and it was telling them about what we would do in the seminar and how we would do it. So we would then also have tasks that were actually focused on the assignment, so that we could make it very clear that the activities that the students were doing all built up into the work that they needed for their final assignment. I've already mentioned there were regular sign-offs for the workbook, but this year not for the study guide. And disappointingly, but perhaps predictably, the submission for that formative feedback was a lot less this year. There were probably 2/3 of the students last year submitted a workbook for some formative feedback, and this year only about a quarter. And the formative feedback, if you like, is the carrot to encourage them to undertake the work. If they submit the work, then they get the formative feedback. If they don't submit the work, then fairly obviously they don't get the formative feedback. There's no punishment for not doing it, but I did think that that would be a big enough carrot, given that there are always students every year who ask if we can look at a draft of work. The inclusion of extra points. Oh yes, sorry. One of the things that I've also added this year to the study guide, because it was going to be an electronic format, and because I therefore also wasn't going to be printing it out, was I looked at a couple of extra things that we could do. So I approached the people at DMU, Healthy DMU, and I spoke to them about what things they would like included as guidance for students. So instead of us saying to students, oh, there's this thing called Healthy DMU, and if you click on these other sites, then you can go there and you can look and you can find this information. I actually took some of the basic information that's included and actually put it into the study guide. So for the first year students that I'm also doing this with, there was actually something on homesickness at one point. There are other things about mental health, about looking after your physical health. And these are all the things that are directly taken from a healthy DMU. So they're not things I've created. They're things that were already available. But rather than students having to go somewhere else to find this information, I included the information into the study guide in order to try and reinforce the fact that extra support was available. And I also did this with the enhancement weeks by talking about the employability stuff that was available, by getting students to think about reviewing what they've done, by pointing them in the direction of other services which are available, like class. So that, again, all of this was contained within a single reference document that hopefully they were looking at on a regular basis. So in terms of some of the inclusion points, I did also take the opportunity to include some motivational pictures. The other thing I thought about, both in terms of the motivational pictures and also the images that I was using as part of the introduction for each week's seminar, I also thought about how I could perhaps take into consideration decolonization. And I know it goes beyond just thinking about those images, but given that this module in particular deals with the advertising industry, and the advertising industry in the UK is still predominantly white and male, this was an opportunity to present some non-white, non-male images that might help students who otherwise could potentially feel that sort of as an industry that they were being excluded. The image on the right-hand side then, this is taken from one of the various different resilience domains that Healthy DMU sent through, and this was about collaboration. And in each case, there's an article, either an article or a video that's promoted by Healthy DMU, or another one that I was able to point them in the direction of. So in terms of the results, and what I've done here, I've done a piece of research from last year that was to do with the workbooks, and I've compared that with the research this year that I've done, where some of the questions were essentially the same question for the study guide. So the blue columns you see there are from the workbook year. So that was the one which was, to be honest, largely unaffected by COVID, and the orange ones are from the current academic year. So these are the ones where, you know, by now there's quite a lot of COVID fatigue. The students are experiencing a completely different approach in terms of delivery. And the three sections of it are, they were asked the question, in this case, the workbook study guide helps me prepare for the live session. And they are completely, somewhat, not at all. So you'll see that actually the results for the workbook were incredibly positive. People were either completely or somewhat helped by the study guide, by the workbook rather, and to prepare for the live sessions. With the study guide, a little bit less so. We've still got substantially, completely, and somewhat, but somewhat, so it wasn't completely in the same way. There is some qualitative data that's been collected as well, but I haven't had the opportunity to actually go through that yet and thematically analyze it. So that will be the next stage. That's also part of what I'm hoping to then get published. So that was the first one, about whether or not it was helping them to prepare for the live session. The next one was whether or not it was helping them to prepare for the assignment. And again, you'll see here, in terms of the workbook, it was completely and somewhat. In the case of the study guide, there were some completely. It was mainly somewhat, still a few not at alls. The next one was the workbook study guide helps me to manage my time. And again, you know, this is one of the big ones. All of these questions, by the way, are expected to reflect the issues that we were addressing in the title of this piece. So again, you'll notice overwhelmingly students felt the workbook had helped them manage their time. Still quite positive for the study guide. Most of them still in the somewhat, quite a substantial amount of not at all. With regards to the workbook, study guide encourages me to attend the live session. Again, I was quite impressed by here. Huge numbers, 75% said completely for the workbook. Now, some of that was almost certainly brought about by the fact that they had to physically bring the workbook into the teaching session for me to physically sign it off. Then a few somewhats, a couple of not at alls. But you'll notice that actually in this particular instance, with regards to the study guide, that although it's balanced between somewhat and not at all, there's still a substantial number who said it didn't make any difference to whether or not they turned up. This one is the feedback from the workbook study guide has helped me with the assignment. Now, bearing in mind that this for the workbook, this does include a number of students for whom the formative feedback actually happened away from the study guide, but it was still incorporated. And you can see here, this one is actually much more even. The study guide still has a much larger number of the not at alls, but the balance in the other areas of the completely and the somewhat was still quite pleasing. It's still quite a substantial number that felt that actually it did substantially or in some way help them towards working towards the assignment. Now, the pinch of salt that's added here is clearly the workbook, had it been implemented in the same way, sorry, study guide, had it been implemented in the same way as the workbook had, may well have actually worked a lot better had we not been going through this current situation, where the remote teaching has made it a lot easier for students to become distanced from and actually disengage from material. And however hard I've tried, with my final year module, for the students there, every week after each seminar, and there are 3 seminars each week, I would actually contact all of the students who hadn't attended, and I just sent them an email going, we missed you in the seminar today, is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to help you? And I have to say the response to that was really minimal. So there are clearly some students who, for lots of different reasons, and I'm sure lots of them are very good reasons, have tended to disengage. And I suspect that's part of what's had an impact on the results of the work. Now, in terms of current changes, and I have a colleague called Anoop, who I was talking to, who had used a very similar approach, but she, instead of producing this as a separate document, and my study guide is a Word document because it's meant to be a working document, had actually effectively done the same thing. So she'd broken it down into step by step, but she'd done it within the Blackboard folder for each week. And so in my first year module in particular, where I'm working with a colleague who delivers the same module but with a different code, because we're working together on this, what we decided is we would try and compare the second semester with the first semester by using this approach. So we've changed this now so that we've broken the lecture up into smaller parts. We've put activities to do in between each one. There are videos, there's little bits of reading to do. In some cases, there are actually images which are embedded within the Blackboard page. And then the students need to go back in and write something about it. And we've tried to use the discussion threads, wikis, journals, Q&As as part of that sort of integration and encouragement to engage with Blackboard as the primary facility. So, future changes. In terms of student engagement, I think we would perhaps look to increase the number of Turnitin submissions. That seems to have worked quite well with the first years, and perhaps that will be an alternative method for us with regards to the final years to encourage them to actually engage with the material more. With regards to the preparation, I'm still not sure whether the study guide or the e-guide works best, and perhaps next year I'm actually going to try and use both. With regards to the time management, I don't know how much of the issue this year has been down to COVID and how much there are other things that we can do with regards to time management. That's probably a conversation that I need to have with students. With regards to participation, it is dependent on the delivery context. I'm very lucky my final year students have a 2-hour seminar in which it's very easy for us to talk about the material, because the material is in essence adverts and we're simply responding to those. In the case of the participation with the first year students, that's proved slightly more problematic, but that might be to do with them being first years. And with regards to performance, as I say, that's the one where I haven't done a year-on-year comparison, but it will be interesting to see what impact it's had. The workbook did seem to have had a positive impact on performance, both in terms of the number of students getting good grades and also the number of students getting, the average grade for the module. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.